All right, board gaming enthusiasts, we've got some mailbag here. I'm working my way through some comments on the channel, some DMs, some email, and a recurring theme, an interesting theme, a couple of questions, kind of merging them, asking as a board gamer, recommendations, board game recommendations, scenarios for board gamers who are sore losers. People that just cannot deal with that loss. And at first it was kind of interesting because I tend to think of that as the domain of the Wargamer, which is kind of interesting because as a Wargamer Fritz, you want to jump into a war game, the entry point, even in some skirmish war games, the entry point is kind of high. You've got to buy your miniatures, paint your miniatures, build some terrain. Often the rules are a little bit complex. Even if they're beer and pretzel rules, they're going to have a level of complexity to them not always seen in board gaming, although, some board games are more complex than war games. We're just kind of generalizing. So it always seemed odd to me when I would play or I would be around war gamers they're never going to flip the table, because it's their miniatures. They're never flipping the table. But I've seen dice thrown. I've seen grown men storm out. I've seen temper tantrums. I've seen a lot, and it always kind of surprised me. But on the board gaming side, that doesn't surprise me as much. And I've played with some sore losers. And look, I've been salty once or twice. Nobody likes to lose, especially if it's a heavy-handed Euro or a game that's supposed to be fair, with no randomness. It's just cards. You control everything. It's never quite that way. I mean, it's still a game. It's still a simulation of sorts. But from that perspective, I think we tend to see more, and it's not a criticism, more sore losers in board gaming because the point of entry is $100 for a base game or sit down at play at the table. Not to mention that wargaming is very, very focused, where board gaming's a lot more mainstream. It's a lot more out there and open in the culture. And that's a great thing. That's why the board gaming hobby, in the past 10 years has just exploded. It's trashed wargaming. It's trashed role-playing games. I would say in many situations and many examples of collaborative play, it's trashing digital. I mean, it's just exploding, and that's fantastic because we get more games, we get more titles. But we have different player personalities. We have different expectations. And that expectation is also potentially you're investing what? An hour, 60, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours into a game. And I find that the shorter the game, the times I've played TI, Twilight Imperium, you might be upset that you lost, or you might think that you can do better, or you play something, Dune plays a lot faster. But from that perspective, games that you sink in a lot of time. I remember years ago playing Axis and Allies, just setting it up and playing it over the course of a summer, really making it determined moves from that perspective. We used to play it over the phone. I set up my copy, you set up your copy, and we make kind of a turn or two and have the boards. Games like that, I never really had sore losers or temper tantrums because you had to commit. You had to really commit to playing it and investing in it. But the games that are just kind of settlers in the beginning was a lot of temper tantrums because you sit down, you play it in an hour, and you're done. So I think it's out there. It exists. I have seen a couple of table flippers in terms of board gaming. It's okay if it's your own game, but I've even seen it where it's other people's games. But how do we prevent that from happening? That's what we're going to kind of jump into now. And I'd love to get your feedback too. I think part of it is it's a question of being upfront about what the game is. You see something like Game of Thrones, and we've been playing a lot of Game of Thrones recently. It's a resource management game from that perspective. It's kind of a war game. It's a conquering game. If you see Lords of Waterdeep, and you're like, oh, it's a D&D game. No, it's a D&D reskin, but it's resource management, and it's tabletop management. When someone sits down to play the game beyond just the bling, to explain to them so they know up front, and how exactly you word that, of course, depends on the personality, that this might take place in this narrative, but it's about managing cubes and cards and getting points and accumulating resources and directing those resources. So part of it is like knowing the adventure. I remember early on, Descent First Edition, bringing that into play, introducing it to my D&D group. A few players were like, wait, why are you just being a jerk and aggressively attacking us with monsters and setting up these traps? And like, why are you picking on my character? Well, because you're the weakest character, or you got isolated from the group, and I'm going to just play my Overlord cards on you. Because at the time, we're talking 2008, we're talking like a million years ago, but at the time, this one versus many, this idea of Descent First Edition was new. I mean, this is when board games were becoming mainstream. It was like, wow, the Overlord, he's not a dungeon master. They're not a dungeon master. They're not a game master. They're the Overlord. They're there to punish you. And once they understood that, where it's not so much the rules, I'm a player controlling the monsters and you're against me, that shifted the perception. So I think it's important to understand where we're going in. The second option is just to avoid the whole thing altogether. But you still can have a mini meltdown. Playing a competitive game. This is one of the reasons why I really like... There's the duality of the Zombicide Black Plague, Zombicide Invader, where the game spawns stuff and miniatures move and you get loot and you make decisions and you've got guns or you've got magic or you've got guns and magic, depending on the system. And in playing that, it's a collaborative game. It's a co-op game. Everyone either wins or loses. So it's not even a player elimination. If your character gets killed, right? You're sitting there, you're playing, you get killed, you get knocked out. Okay, you lost. If you start getting salty, well, first of all, the game killed you, so you can't take it out on me. And second of all, you can't get angry that now we're going to continue to play because the entire team lives or dies on that decision. And early on, it did irk me a little bit with the Zombicide mechanism of play, where if we're playing 6 characters, and I'm not talking solo play, I'm talking playing with a group. If we've got 6 characters and we're making it through some of the bigger missions and the table's spawned and we're kind of in that sweet spot visually and we're doing well, if someone gets killed, why can't we continue on? Why does the game have to reset? And thinking about it, that irked me a little bit, but thinking about it long term, I think that's good for the mechanic because it's a co-op game and you don't want anyone sitting out, right? We don't want someone sitting out of the game. Reset. Everyone resets. So I think, and I tend to look, if I'm bringing a game to an open club, an open forum, and the way I play is that when I do that, everyone has a spot at my table. I want everyone to play. So if the game is rated for 6 people, we're bringing Black Plague, and 10 people want to play, then you know what? We'll figure it out. I got 10 trays. We got a lot of characters. Pathfinder the Adventure card game, we've played above the minimums on it. We just kind of seed the decks a little bit differently, and maybe if we go through quicker, that's okay. But in having an open table and in having open players and different player personalities mixing and matching, I've found bringing titles that are complete co-op, everybody wins or loses with a game interrupt mechanic, meaning if you die, we all lose, we reset. While not ideal, I find that keeps the table flipping to a minimum. It keeps the sore loser aspect to a minimum. The final piece I would say, if you're part of a regular gaming group and someone gets salty and someone kind of throws that temper tantrum on losing, the way we have dealt with that, not naming any names, the way we've dealt with that is to let that person who is upset, and it's not a question of whether they're right or wrong, it's feelings, how they feel. The question is, let them pick the next game. What we do with the gaming group when we play tabletop face-to-face is we try to agree ahead of time the 2 titles that we're going to play. If they're medium weight games, obviously if it's TI, it's going to be its own event, or Descent First Edition, its own event. But we kind of get together ahead of time and saying, hey, next week, let's agree on 2 games to play. Sometimes it'll be like, well, we can agree on 1 game to play and everyone else bring like 2 or 3 titles that they feel like playing. And when we get there, we'll just see what we're feeling. And if enough people show up, often what we do is we'll play 1 game together and then kind of break out into two groups and have two other types of games going. I find that if you're in that group and someone starts to feel isolated or feel upset, hey, I lost, I got picked on, the game didn't work out, I'm salty, I'm frustrated, whatever it's going to be, just be like, you know what? Not because you lost and you're pulling attitude, but you pick the game. What do you want to play next week? And I find that not only diffuses the situation, but also if that losing streak continues. And I guess we should talk about how to break a losing streak in board gaming. We just looked at that for wargaming. The tactics are very much there in terms of board games. Letting them pick the game, that goes a long way. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys in the comments. Table flippers, people that get upset, board gamers that just are upset about winning, sore losers, all that type of stuff. We're going to lump it in. How do you deal with it? How should we deal with it? And what's the way to keep your gaming group intact if you are a close-knit group of gamers? So it's not like D&D role-playing games where something blows up, the tabletop literally blows up, everyone's surprised, and now everyone's asking the question, what the heck do we do now?